Dalton Phillips, CEO of DAA, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you here. I'm going to jump straight in with your passenger traffic figures, if I may, because as we sit here mid-January, these have just been released. Now, for 2021, you were down 74% compared with normal times. But I know that behind that figure, we can see some interesting variances between domestic and international and continental Europe, Britain. Could you tell us a little bit more about that picture?
So obviously the shape of 2020 and 2021 were very different, albeit we ended up with the same numbers. So they were both down 75% on 2019. But the shape was very different, with last year being very quiet, obviously, in the first half, and then starting to build. I mean, we were getting a bit of traction and starting to feel a bit more confident. And by October, we had some weeks which were 60% of 2019, and then obviously bang, Omicron came and it set us right back. And in fact, December was about 47% of 2019. In terms of the regional variances, so the US is a really strong market for us, and Dublin is connected. It's one of the fifth most connected cities to all of North America, and we're a real gateway into the North American market. And obviously that got shut totally. So that was really difficult. And once it opened, load factors, essentially 100% almost. But we really struggled there. And then other international long-haul markets, particularly with Australia, New Zealand, has a huge market into Dublin with Irish diaspora. That obviously got shut down, and then the Far East as well, which was a new market for us that we'd been really developing and nurturing. So they all got clobbered. Obviously the UK is a big market for us. And then Eastern Europe was our strongest market over the whole period. So we go into 2022 more optimistic and feeling a lot better.
So when you talk about depressed figures and clearly a great deal of uncertainty, what does that do to your financials?
Well, it decimates it. So our net debt doubled. We had to go out into the public markets to raise €1 billion of increased liquidity. We lost in 2020 €300 million. We're closing out 2021 now. It'll be a significant number as well. So it puts you in a tight spot. And the problem with the debt mountain is that airport groups often take on large loads of debt, but that's to invest in a 15 or a 20 or a 25-year piece of infrastructure. So we've gone out to the markets, we've raised a lot of money, but essentially you're using that just to keep yourself alive, and it's been channeled into OPEX where it should have been channeled into CAPEX. And so you've got these airport groups like ours, which are heavily debt laden with big infrastructure ambitions ahead of us, trying to figure out how to square that circle.
So moving forward, you're not only trying to recover and build back, but of course there is now this mantra, we all need to build back better. How can you invest in the short, medium, longer term when you're actually starting from this position today?
Well, it's a difficult spot because obviously you don't control in our case, we don't control our top line. Our top line is set by the regulator. And as we went into this pandemic, the regulator had reduced our charges by 23%. So we already had what we believe is some of the most, or arguably the most competitive charges in all of Europe. And then the regulator shoved us down another 23%. So that was difficult going through the pandemic with these already depressed charges. You've got the airlines saying, as is their mantra, when volumes are good, we need lower prices because volumes are good. And when volumes are depressed, the mantra's the same. We need lower prices because volumes are depressed. So we've got to figure that out. At the same time, we have a huge challenge as an industry around the decarbonisation agenda. And if you take our particular business, we'll need to invest at least €1 billion over this decade just in infrastructure projects that are going to contribute to reducing our carbon footprint. We have to cut emissions by 50% before the end of the decade. So it's an incremental billion just on those sorts of projects. So you've got a balance sheet that's under pressure. You've got a customer and a regulator who's trying to push pricing down even further. Don't ask me. Well, you understand why. And you've got these huge obligations to ensure that we hit our part of the Green Deal. So it's going to be really interesting. This is 3D chess. I think this is why we're all in the business, to try and work our way through this.
And you've mentioned airport charges, which are particularly spiky at the moment because, of course, everybody's hurting. And also the challenge that you have to invest sustainably at the same time. Around the charges debate, what do you think needs to happen next so this doesn't just remain a locking of horns?
Well, I definitely think we need greater communication between all the different parties along the supply chain. And look, clearly the airlines are in a very difficult position. Their balance sheets have been stretched, as have ours, as have the ground handlers and other people in the ecosystem. So I think, first of all, we just need to be a little bit more transparent with each other and open up and talk about these issues, because otherwise it ends up being a sort of a binary I win, you lose scenario. I'm in this industry 5 years. Prior to that, I was in the retail grocery sector. And what really struck me coming into aviation was the fact that people really don't share any information. There's absolute distrust right across the supply chain in general. And when I was working in retail, look, you're all trying to serve the one customer, but you would share huge amounts of data up and down the supply chain, and we don't do any of that. So we need to recognize as an industry that airlines have balance sheet challenges and airports have balance sheet challenges, that airlines need to invest in their decarbonisation agenda and in new fleets, but the airports also need to invest. And somehow we've got to pay for all of this, and actually, ultimately, the consumer needs to pay for this. But at the moment, we don't seem to be able to shift the debate that way. But I know that ACI are obviously jumping right into the middle of the ring here. So look, I think you're a big unlock in all of this.
Well, I don't think we can actually talk about issues that are hitting the headlines around charges without also mentioning the issue that's been dominating the headlines for a few days now, which is that of slots. Do you think that the level of slots which has been set for this season, do you think the European Commission has got this right, or do you think the airlines have a point? Where do you think we should go with the slots discussion?
Well, look, we're in the winter season, and the slot waiver is at 50%, which I think is very fair, given the situation we're in. As we look to the summer, it's 64%. So, look, as you know better than I do, we've been pushing as ACI and as an industry that it should be 70%. So I think there are challenges around it. We need competition. We can't have people hoarding slots. I mean, pre-pandemic, we had about we were in, if you take Dublin Airport, absolutely stretched, capacity constrained, really struggling to fulfill the demand out there. And 6% of our slots were sat on for a variety of different reasons, and I won't go into it, but basically were non-utilized because of various rules. And that is capacity that's been lost in the system and ultimately creates a greater cost for the entire industry, because we're having to build extra capacity in other ways to mitigate these slots that are essentially being hoarded. So I'm for competition and open it up, and we can't have big incumbent airlines sitting on these slots. It's absolutely redundant.
And is there a regulatory remedy to that, or is this really behavioural? Or maybe it's the issue of transparency.
I think it's a bit of both that's going on. I mean, clearly we've got the justified non-use of slots provision that's out there at the moment. So there is force majeure out there, and we can support, and we all need to be big people about this. But we can't have a situation where people are essentially hoarding a slot, not flying at the beginning of the season, not flying at the end of the season, just taking the filet mignon in the middle, and forcing other competitors who'd like to get into those markets out. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Let's move back to the issue of sustainability, which you mentioned earlier on in the context of investment and the investment that's going to be needed to build back better. But at DAA, you've actually been there from the outset with us on airport carbon accreditation. Your airports were actually there at the very start of the programme. And I think it's worth mentioning as well that during the pandemic, Dublin actually went up a level of accreditation. So kudos to you for that. Of course, sustainability in aviation isn't just about those things that are under our control. And one of the biggest issues on the table now in the Fit for 55 agenda is fuel. Where do you think airports have a role to play in what is happening moving forwards around the sustainable aviation fuels debate, which is now, I think, going to be at the heart of things moving forwards?
Look, we have to play our part and we have to be there and enable the infrastructure. And I think we just need to work out some of the mechanisms around that. So if you take sustainable aviation fuel, I think that the regulation seems to be pointing that it's incumbent upon the airport to ensure the infrastructure is in place for SAF. On one side, I absolutely agree with that. We just need to make sure that the charge for that is apportioned to the provider. So if the airport is the provider of SAF, then they obviously need to build that infrastructure. But actually, if the airport is only facilitating a fuel supplier who provides that SAF, then the infrastructure costs need to be borne by the fuel supplier. So we just need to make sure, and I think there's a bit of nuance that needs to be sorted out there. In terms of fixed electrical ground power, look, we're all on that journey, but we have criteria we have to, in terms of contact stands by 2025 and 2030 for remote stands, we're on that journey too. But I think we need to be just wise to some of the smaller airports, which are already, I think 70% of sub 5 million airports across Europe are loss-making, that if we're forcing them to electrify remote stands, I mean, it's just going to be totally uneconomic and probably not going to do anything for the environment anyway, because the actual cost in terms of I'm talking about engineering cost in terms of getting a remote stand to a regional airport that's only serving a remote stand once in a blue moon. I mean, it's a disaster. So I think we just need to be practical about it. But big picture, airports, big important part to play in this journey, and we need to invest in it, which goes back to the fact that all of this costs money. Somebody needs to pay for it. I don't think the airlines need to pay for it, but we collectively need to figure out who does pay for this.
Would impact assessments be a solution to this, or do you think there's a different remedy on the horizon for us?
No, I think there's a role for the impact assessments. But I just think we need to be practical about how we go about this. And we all have a collective agenda, which we need to decarbonize this industry. Remember, it's not, as you know so well, it's not the aviation that's the problem. It's the emissions that are the problem. So let's keep working on the emissions, but let's invest in it as an industry. And clearly the airlines are doing a lot of that. The OEMs are doing a terrific job there, but we can't forget the airports.
Just drawing to a close, I would like to finish off just talking about your airports and their role in the community. When we talk about sustainability and the infrastructure and so on, and you've also mentioned the much smaller airports, they're actually sited, of course, in the heart of a community, and in some cases they're the major employer in a community, and we've seen a lot of rallying round and community spirit during the pandemic. What's this been like for you at your airports?
Look, I think no different to others. You're absolutely right. Communities generally are incredibly proud of their airports, and we've got to be good neighbours to our community. And you think about, like, if you take Dublin Airport, for example, we employ about 20,000 people on the campus. 70% of those live within commuting, with near commuting distance of the airport. So the community is benefiting massively from the employment from the airport. But at the same time, there is an obligation on the airport to be that good citizen. In our particular case, and many airports will do something similar, we have a community fund. It's like a 10 million euro fund. People can apply within the community for different projects that benefit the community, including educational allowances for people to go to university if they're coming from sort of a difficult economic environment. So I think we've got to play a key role in our community. I think we're I'm happy with how we're doing it. And I'm not so sure that I see this as an issue when I speak to my peers who all seem to recognize the importance of being in that community, embedded and vested in it.
If you had just one prediction for 2022, what would it be?
Well, I'm the glass half full on this one, and I think Omicron's been through. I think we've learned a huge amount from Omicron. We've learned that restrictions, when they just pull the lever like that, don't work. So we pulled all the restrictions, assuming that we could we could prevent that virus moving across the borders, that restricting travel would stop it all. Of course, it was a total disaster. Like, the virus, and there are many research studies out there, shows that it was pervasive in the communities prior to all these restrictions. So I think my prediction is that we won't be pulling that lever so strongly at a governmental level like we have in the past. And actually that pent-up demand that we all know is there will really come through. And this year we could be 75% of 2019, which would be a fantastic place to be. But look, let's see.
Dalton Phillips, thank you very much indeed.